let's go back to the business that you exited just a couple years. So when I met you, you were coming to Puerto Rico and you still had a business, but you were going through an exit and you were in distressed mortgages. Do you see that as something that is on the horizon that you may look to invest in again?
Definitely, and it was a crazy run. I'll tell the quick version of the story. So, after 2008, I left Rochester. I grew up in New Jersey. I'd always wanted to live in New York City, and found a job on Craigslist, of all things, for a small private equity fund that was buying non-performing loans. So, December 2008, I'm literally working on Wall Street. I coincidentally lived on Wall Street also, so my commute to work was further vertically than it was horizontally. I lived across the street.
Wow.
And really just got thrown into the fire. The firm I was at had bought $400 million of non-performing second mortgage HELOCs, home equity lines of credit, for 3 cents on the dollar.
Yeah.
And you got to remember, back in 2008, you thought it was easy to think that almost all of them were just going to get wiped out through foreclosure because the average home was 50% underwater in California. Mm-hmm. What we didn't really realize was the amount of pressure from the government and the regulators to do modifications. And ultimately, it worked out as a win-win because the banks that did modifications to those borrowers who could afford to stay. There was a lot of people who had a short-term job loss that could afford to make monthly payments but couldn't afford the $10,000, $20,000, $30,000 to reinstate.
Yeah.
So those scenarios, it was really easy to make a win-win. And then over the course of 3 to 5 years, real estate values started recovering. The bottom was 2010. By 2013, 2014, we were in another upcycle of real estate. So a lot of people that were underwater now had equity again.
Yeah.
And a lot of those home equity lines ended up getting paid off in full.
I think if you were able to keep your borrowers, so you're buying this 3%, you're buying the second mortgage debt at 3%. If you could somehow keep your borrowers from foreclosure on the first mortgage, you eventually were going to make a pile of money, right? Like, so
exactly.
that was going to come back, and that was the thing. Is like I can remember being at the foreclosure sale, seeing millions and millions of dollars getting wiped out. Second mortgages were just getting wiped out. As the first mortgage would foreclose, nobody cared or thought about the second mortgage at all. It just got completely wiped out. But if you could somehow keep those borrowers from going into foreclosure with the first mortgage, you're eventually going to make a pile of money buying this debt.
Exactly, and I know groups who made generational wealth doing that trade, and that was only a piece of what I did. So I was at that firm for about a year and a half, and then I went on my own. Was buying, selling, brokering with a few of my clients that I'd met, and then eventually partnered with a small family office, and really just running a few $1 million buying and selling, primarily first liens, but we did buy some seconds when we could. It was sort of like trading options versus just buying first liens was more traditional real estate. We were able to buy at 50 to 60% of the current value of the property.
Yeah.
Often those values were half of what they were 3 to 5 years ago. So we'd always buy at a discount to the collateral, much like when you're flipping a house.
So they may owe 300, the house is worth 150, and you're buying at 75.
Exactly. And then in many cases, we would reduce the balance for the borrower. A lot of times we would do it contingently, like you have to pay us for 12 months.
Yep.
And if you could sell or refinance your house, we would then give you a break on your principal balance because we wanted to incentivize them to eventually pay us off.
Yeah.
And we could afford to offer significant discounts if they would do that.
So this was like a pure cash flow play for the most part, right?
Exactly.
You're going to have a section of the portfolio that you're just going to lose. You're going to have a section of it that you have to foreclose on and take the real estate. But in the middle is cash flow.
Exactly.
And pretty good cash flow.
Exactly.
If you're even at, and I'm trying to picture the rates, but they're probably 5% rates on most of that stuff.
Some of them 7 or 8 too.
And you're at $75,000 investment, but they're 5% on $150,000, or they're 5% on $300,000. You modify to $150,000. So what does that effectively put your rate at? You're at 5% on double the money.
Yeah, I mean, it was often double-digit returns, absolutely.
Yeah.
The loans that we performed were most of the time double-digit returns. The only time that they weren't is, in some cases later in the business, we would buy loans that were previously modified through like a HAMP or HARP program where there was a point where some of the lenders were giving these 2.5% modifications. So we had to be careful of those, and we would actually model in risk of reperformance in those scenarios if somebody had a 2% rate. But many of the rates were 7, 8, 9% too, especially those 05, 06, 07 loans.
Yeah.
They had very high rates. So we'd often give some interest rate relief just to make it reasonable. But we also wanted to incentivize people to refinance.
Yeah. You don't want to give them too good of a rate or they never refinance.
Exactly.
So what we're talking about is housing, right? Like, so you were doing this debt play on housing, and I think I know the answer to this, but do you see that same kind of distress happening right now? Do you think there's going to be this massive crash in the housing real estate market over the next few years?
Yeah, the answer is absolutely not.
Right.
And having lived through 2008, there's a number of differences this time, and a couple reasons for that. Number one is going into the 2008 crash, you had a population of borrowers that many of whom probably shouldn't have gotten loans.
Right.
And the loans they got were these option arms where they were either negative amortizing or the rate was scheduled to go up. Today, we've got a record number of borrowers who locked an interest rate for 30 years below 4%. I believe 30 to 40% of homeowners actually don't even have a mortgage. Another 30, 35% are locked below 4%. So you have about 70% of the market right now that is not really being affected by these rising interest rates.
Yep.
And so there's no inventory.
Right.
Even with the higher rates, most houses are still selling within 30 days. There's record low inventory, and this is going to probably persist for a number of years until life events just sort of eventually force people to either die or retire and move to Florida. And some of those people may just rent the house out as well. We talked earlier about rental rates are higher than they've ever been before. So if you refinance at 3%, you may be able to rent your house out, make a few $1,000s a month. And if you're going to move to Florida, you just move to Florida and maybe
keep that free money. I mean, so if you locked in under 5%, I believe your effective cost is near zero, right? If you're at 3%, it's free money. If you're at zero, obviously, you're not worried about it at all. But if you borrowed money at 3-4%, inflation's higher than that. So you're at an effective rate of real close to zero, and no reason for you to panic and sell. And by the way, you can rent your house for more than your payment is. So I agree with you. I think that it's not this big bubble for housing. I just don't see it. Back in 2006, I remember that I knew the bubble was coming because you could get your dog a mortgage. I mean, literally anybody could get a mortgage. And then the other thing that was the telltale giveaway for me was when my dental hygienist showed up at the foreclosure sale and bought a property and actually made money.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, it's all coming. It's all going away now, right? It's like if everybody's doing something and that they're not supposed to be able to do it. So I don't see that going on. I see it as it's a lot harder to be in the real estate investing game right now. So you don't see that kind. I don't have it as that kind of bubble. But I think where we both agree that the bubble is on this commercial side.
Yeah, absolutely. Both office buildings, to some extent retail, and a very much of a niche, but a niche in multifamily. Multifamily has so many different types of owners. There's corporate owners, there's publicly traded companies, there's family offices. There's a lot of multifamily owners who have 10-year fixed rate debt and are in no trouble at all. Mm-hmm. But there is a vocal minority of these syndicators who invested over the last 5 years that got caught up in these bridge loan deals that have been affected by this interest rate. So there's pockets of deep distress as good as 2008. So when I talk to residential investors who say they're waiting out the crash, I tell them, you're potentially missing it because it's happening right under your nose. It's just in a different niche. Yeah. And Howard Marks, has a founder of Oak Tree Capital, he has a great book on market cycles, and he repeats this constantly in the book that history may not repeat itself, but it does rhyme. Yeah. And that's what we're seeing right now.
Yeah. So it's not happening in housing, but it is happening in office, for instance. I see an opportunity in office and what we've been doing is converting office to housing. So for instance, a play that we do often now on the island of Puerto Rico is to buy office condominiums, and hopefully enough of them that we control the HOA and then thereby the building, and then convert from office that nobody's been in 10 years and do a massive renovation to the building and to the condominiums and turn them into apartments. And that's way cheaper than the build, where you can't build them, but you do the renovation. So if we can build for $150 a square foot, but we can renovate for $70 a square foot, now we can create workforce housing. Now we can create some more pressure. We can relieve some pressure on the lower income housing problem.
Yeah, it's a great strategy. I lived it in New York. I lived down in the financial district where there was a lot of Class B office spaces, and eventually they were building new high rises in Midtown, and it just became more trendy to to have an office in Midtown.
Hey guys, thanks for watching that. Subscribe to our channel, watch this next, and then also check out the pinned content for more great content, guys. God bless.